This is the Latin News Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Colombia. This week, we're going to be addressing Guatemala, and our very special guest is Edgar Ortiz. He's currently in Washington, D.C., and he's an expert in constitutional law and political risk in Guatemala. And so we get the opportunity to take a look, this is like 10 months in, at the presidency of Bernardo Arévalo and the hopeful changes that may have taken place in Guatemala at the moment. So, Edgar, welcome on the Latin News Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure because Guatemala is a country that is close to my heart. I'm not going to lie. And I have to say that there was a feeling of hope. There was a feeling of change with the election of Bernardo Arévalo. But we have to say he's come up against all sorts of challenges in these last 10 months, not least challenges from an area that is now being referred to as the Pacto de Corruptos, the corrupt pact. Perhaps you should give us a little bit of background on this.
Sure. So I think we should go back to 2015. Back then, we had this special commission from the United Nations called CICIG. And CICIG was a very special, particular entity that was called by Guatemala itself a few years ago to help us fight corruption. And this commission that year indicted the sitting president and sitting vice president and put them both in jail. Protests followed the indictments, and the streets were full of people protesting against corruption. And it seemed back then that the country was going to change for good. But then in the 2015 elections, that was the same year we had elections, we elected this outsider, Jimmy Morales, a former comedian. And the thing is that during Morales' years, that's 2016 to 2020, we saw how the political class resisted the fight against corruption. And so by 2017, CICIG continued his fight of corruption and brought charges against maybe 500 people at least, including high-ranked officials, members of Congress, as I said, a president, a vice president, and also some people from the business sector, and among others. So back in 2017, there was a backlash. Like the political class said, this is enough. We can't allow this to happen. And they organized this coalition of, let's call it anti-corruption coalition. And its main goal back then was to get rid of this commission, get rid of CICIG. And they managed to do it in 2019. And again, in 2019, we held elections again. And we elected a guy named Alejandro Yamatei, a former director of the prison system in Guatemala. And what happened pretty much during Yamatei years was that things got worse. The Pacto of the Corrupt not only managed to get rid of these anti-corruption efforts, but from 2020 to up to date, let's say, they advanced the agenda in a more anti-democratic way by putting in jail all the people who helped during these anti-corruption years. So we have in exile now probably 45 former judges, prosecutors, journalists who were seen by the Pact of the Corrupt as the faces of this anti-corruption movement.
Okay, so the Pact of the Corrupt, we're pointing at a high class of politicians, business leaders, industrialists, I would imagine part of the military. They don't want change. They don't want transparency.
Yeah, that's pretty much the right reading of the situation. We need to say that probably what is making things worse is that during the last 20 years, probably, we have seen the rise of a new elite. Basically, corruption itself created an financially autonomous political class. So we have these new millionaires who earn his money by doing dirty business with the state. If you look at Congress today, we have a Congress of 160 seats. Probably 70% of them are owners, indirectly, of course, of construction companies, and they build roads for the state or for the municipalities. So their fortune is 100% dependent on government's contracts. And those are the most predatory political elite we have, because they are short-sighted, they are very predatory, as I said, and those are the ones who more aggressive stance against corruption fighters. And they don't want transparency because they want to make dirty deals with government and they don't want to get caught. And not only that, they want to take control of everything. I mean, they want to make dirty business with everything they see in the state. So every office is seen as an opportunity to earn some money. You will have, corruption at very low level in Guatemala, where a boss may charge 10% or 20% of the salary to a person he hires as a way of living. So my point is, we have like this predatory political elite that is not only at the elite level, but it's at all levels in office, municipalities, members of Congress, and up to the higher positions in the state.
And Bernardo Arévalo, how is he addressing this institutional corruption in Guatemala? Because obviously it's not a popular move by the opposition, let's say, that he tries to address it. What is his tactic?
Well, I would say that maybe we should talk about Arévalo before and the 2023 elections, because we need some context. I have been saying since 2023 that Arévalo's election was a glitch in the matrix for two reasons. First, let's bear in mind that the Pact of the Corrupt in 2023 had a plan. And the plan was, okay, we're not Nicaragua. We don't have like Daniel Ortega, strong leader. We have like a coalition of, multiple fragmented political parties. I mean, by the way, political parties doesn't mean much in Guatemala because we always elect every election a president who belongs to a different political party. Well, the thing is, they had this coalition, and the only agreement was we're not allowing anyone from the opposition to win. And by opposition, I mean anti-corruption parties like Arévalo's party Semilla, but also outsiders. So basically what they did in 2023 election was they blocked any outsider in the election. So they got rid of 3 candidates who probably would win the election. So the thing is, Arévalo won, but he only managed to get 13% of voting in the first round. And he made it to the second round, to the runoff against Sandra Torres, as I always say. Sandra Torres, a former first lady. There's only one universal rule of Guatemalan politics, and that rule is Sandra Torres will always lose a runoff.
Yes, it's true.
You know that because you know Guatemala. So basically, Arévalo won because he was there. I mean, and he was consistent, and he has this small party, always having this consistent anti-corruption approach. But the thing is, he's too weak. They have 23 seats out of 160 in Congress. They barely could, organize a cabinet to rule because they have, they're a small party. They don't have like a lot of people to call. Also, not many people wants to go to the public sector. It's very hard to find a minister. That's probably crazy from someone who is from another country. Like, why wouldn't anyone want to be a minister? Nobody wants to be a minister in Guatemala because too dangerous. You may face persecution, whatever. So in addressing the corruption problem, he's in a weak position, not only because his minority situation in Congress, but also because he doesn't control the judiciary, and the judiciary is not independent, by the way. We can talk about this later. And the fact that the Attorney General's office, and this is like the biggest problem of Guatemala right now, is in hands of the Pacto of the Corrupt's most aggressive figure, Consuelo Porras. And the AG's office is an independent body. It's like an autonomous agency in Guatemala. So President Arévalo has little power over the AG's office. And the AG's office is the one who the last 5 years has been dismantling these anti-corruption efforts we had, and also the office in charge of bringing charges to former prosecutors and anti-corruption judges. So if Arévalo wants to address corruption, he doesn't have the AG's office. He doesn't have an independent judiciary. So and he doesn't have a majority in Congress. So he's basically alone in the executive, and he hasn't found his way to bring this anti-corruption agenda into something concrete.
Porras, there's no way of replacing the Attorney General. There's no legal mechanism, because obviously it would be screamed at for being unconstitutional and illegal, but Arévalo hasn't tried to get rid of Porras?
I mean, his efforts to confront the AG were poorly conducted. There's another funny story about anti-corruption years, and that is in 2016, Congress changed the law of the AG to protect the AG, because prior to 2016, the president had the authority to remove the AG basically for any reason. So they changed that, and they made it impossible to remove the AG. And now Arévalo is facing that constraint. And the thing is, if he wanted to do something aggressive, he could do it in the first days, but he didn't. He chose a different path, and this is probably the big problem with Arévalo, in my opinion. Like, he's too democratic minded for a country like Guatemala, and his understanding of how you would transition from this semi-authoritarian regime to a democracy is probably, in my opinion, mistaken, because he thinks, okay, if I have this democratic attitude, things are going to change. And the thing is, the problem is that other actors are behaving in a, straight anti-democratic way, especially the AG. And he chose a path that was basically destined to fail. He summoned the AG under a very dubious legal argument and tried to remove her for disobedience. And of course, that didn't work. And he lost like 3-4 months. And the only thing he managed is that the AG got more aggressive. She tried to bring charges against Arévalo, and she started a fight. I mean, a really straight fight against Arévalo, and she managed to build coalitions. I mean, this is crazy. If you look at the AG, she's holding meetings with members of Congress and mayors all the time to show her strength. And that's pretty much what Arévalo achieved with this weak strategy to strengthen the AG's figure.
This is obviously incredibly concerning and negative for the presidency, again, that offered change. But there have to have been, or have there been, some achievements by the current president and government in dealing with some of the institutional corruption, because we've mentioned it. It's top to bottom, bottom to top corruption, low level, high level, mid level. Arévalo had to start somewhere. Have we seen some positive news?
Well, I mean, I think that the fact that Arévalo is in office is a positive news. It's
Yes.
positive news.
Yes.
The very fact that he's in office, because they tried last year to prevent him to take office. And by the way, I mean, you could see the streets full of people protesting to defend the elections, especially the indigenous sector. And so the fact that he's in office is good news. Also, the fact that he's a democratic president, I mean, with democratic attitudes, is good. And he has appointed, I would say, a decent team of ministers that are trying to change things. And I think that you can criticize Arévalo for many things, but at least he is trying to have decent people in key positions. And I will say, for example, the infrastructure minister. That is the toughest job in the executive branch, probably, because all the corruption is focused there. Because, as I mentioned, many corrupt politicians have these companies who do their deals with the state, and the guy is very committed to end corruption there. And he's trying to do it. Of course, it's super hard because the former government already signed a lot of contracts that are dirty, but are, binding to the government. So they have to pay to these dirty, corrupt companies, and they are trying to revise the contracts and to clean the house. And that's taken them, of course, a lot of time, and it comes at a cost also. And that it's probably like the biggest challenge for Arévalo, because sometimes you get slower at adjudicating these contracts for building roads or bridges, because you need to be sure that you're not giving the contract to a dirty company, for example. And that's the situation pretty much right now.
And you see, Arévalo and his democratic attitudes, again, very refreshing for a country like Guatemala. I think back to the trial of Rios Montt, and then, of course, the election of Jimmy Morales and so on, Alvaro Colom. I think of all of these politicians not with a lot of favor. And now what you're telling me is obviously when we talk about the challenges facing Arévalo, the Pacto de Corruptos, the Pact of the Corrupt, do appear to be firmly entrenched in the institution. So you say that the infrastructure minister has a hard job. He has to go through all of the different contracts. But are we in danger in 3 years' time, or when the next election rolls around, that it will just swing back to the Pacto again, and it will be business as usual?
That's my main concern, because at the end of the day, Arévalo can do much in office, and I see the country like in the middle of two forces. You will say Arévalo represents this democratic agenda, like this dream of, we want to live in a democratic country, we want to fight corruption. And the other extreme, you will find the anti-democratic, let's say, core group of the Pact of the Corrupt. But in the middle, you have like these transactional politicians who are not actually that anti-democratic as probably Consuelo Porras is. You will find there in this, what I call transactional politicians, short-sighted politicians who want to do dirty business. They don't care much about, staging a coup against Arévalo, as probably the AG is. But the thing is, they are looking at both sides, and they are saying, okay, Arévalo looks really weak. It may not be smart for me to join Arévalo's ranks because I may lose. Or what happens very often, that if you are thinking of joining Arévalo's ranks and you're a, let's say, transactional politician, you will receive threats from the AG. And you don't see Arévalo doing anything about it because he claims, I can do anything, sorry. So at the end of the day, it is a matter of time. And I think that the anti-democratic core of the Pact of the Corrupt is playing this dirty game in which they are waiting for Arévalo to become less popular. And when he becomes less popular, because it's obvious, if you're not achieving like big goals, you will become unpopular over time. So that would be like the moment to attack and to try to overthrow Arévalo's government. You only need an impeachment majority in Congress, which is 2/3. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. And that's, to me, like the biggest risk of the country in the short term or medium term.
And when we talk about an impeachment, that would be, again, a peaceful way forward. But is there a possibility of an armed coup? Or, because it does seem like there are plenty of interests, certainly at odds with Arévalo.
Well, I don't see that as a big threat in the short term, because I think the Pact of the Corrupt sees Arévalo as weak, and they don't think he can do much, and they know something like a violent coup or military action is very unpopular, and they are already so unpopular, that they can they couldn't win an election, with all the money they had. I mean, this is another thing, the Yamate government, they threw literally millions of quetzales in the campaign, and they lost. So they know they're unpopular. They really know it. And besides, the military has changed over time. We don't have like these old officials that we had in the 90s that really had this mentality of, no, we are taking the power because that's our role. I think this new generation of officials has a different mindset, more democratic, let's say. And the most important thing is they don't need the army because they have the legal system.
Yeah.
And I would describe Guatemala as an abusive, legalistic constitutional regime. So all they need is an excuse, and a tribunal will say whatever you want, and you can stage a coup legally.
An abusive, legalistic, what? An abusive, legalistic regime. All right, yeah. That's an interesting. And also, they don't want to draw attention from the international community to some sort of a violent uprising. The US obviously would not look kindly upon that, neither with any, let's say, allies in the region, the more democratic countries in the region, I guess Costa Rica, Panama, they would not look very favorably along this. But so if we move on from the Pacto de Corruptos a little bit, of course, they're involved in what's coming up, but we need to talk about security. And Guatemala has had its fair share of security issues. And I do know that one of the key battles that Arévalo has been picking is trying to fight against extortion. But I don't see, or I don't know if there's been any achievement on this front.
Well, speaking generally of violence, I mean, if you look at the numbers, homicide rates has been going down since 2012. And that's true also for Arévalo's period. Back in August, that's the last data we have, you saw a 6% decrease in homicides during the first 8 or 9 months of 2024. Extortion is harder to measure because most of the time people do not file a complaint when they get extorted. So you have less clear data to see if things are getting better. I think that the Minister of Interior is a competent person. He used to be a Minister of Interior during the Álvaro Colom years for a short time, by the way, for a few months. But he worked for the think tank world for a few years, so he knows what he's doing. And it seems in the short term that they are doing, what they can. They are focused on structural measures because one of the, let's say, spillover effects of this anti-democratic attitude we saw in the last years in the country is that they ruined this police reform. We had this professionalization of police reform back in 2010, and we were having good results. But in 2018, during the Jimmy Morales years, we saw how during this crazy attacks against the international community, because the international community was on the anti-corruption side, so they saw these officials that were trained during the professionalization years as a threat. So they fired more than 200 or 300 professional officials in the police. So I think they're working on bringing those people back or starting a new program because you need a professional police force to address these issues. So I think they're more focused on those structural changes. And in the short term, of course, they have, made some important ratings and important attentions.
And what are the main security challenges facing Guatemala at the moment? It's a transit country, I imagine, for the transshipment of illegal drugs from the south. Is there a gang problem?
Not like in El Salvador or Honduras. Actually, the data we have in Guatemala is that violence was more associated to sometimes personal affairs. For example, we see like higher levels of violence in regions or departments, we call departments the regions, where you have a higher rate of gun carriage. So in those regions where people carry guns, sometimes they'll solve their problems in a violent way. So there's a bunch of noise in those numbers. And in these big cities, you have a gang problem. But as I said before, not in the size that you see in Honduras and El Salvador. Regarding the drug trafficking cartels, there has been a huge change in the dynamics of drug trafficking in Guatemala over the last 10 years, because most of the big barons of the big drug barons were detained and extradited. Some of them are back, by the way, because they served short sentences in the US. But you have now like this proliferation of small cartels, like small organizations that only are devoted to transit and that work for pretty much every cartel in Mexico. So luckily we haven't seen like a rising violence among these small operators like you saw in Mexico, because in Mexico you have this violence problem because they are fragmented and they are fighting each other. We have this fragmentation in Guatemala, but luckily we haven't seen like much violence yet.
That's good to hear. And one thing that always jumps out at me, again, having known the country very, very well, is the issue of development, but not so much development, but indigenous rights. You have a vast population of original indigenous inhabitants in the country who have always or routinely been seen as the underclass and treated as the underclass in Guatemala. In fact, when I remember back to 1998 or 1999, when there was I guess it was a referendum on whether all indigenous languages would be legally binding national languages in Guatemala, which was of course voted down. But is there a move to improve indigenous rights? Is the government acting out on the demands to, I guess, lift people out of the inequality and poverty?
I would say that definitely there has been a huge shift in the relationship with indigenous groups under the Arévalo presidency. Mm-hmm. And it's not my perception. I mean, I highly recommend to your listeners an interview. It's available in English that El Faro conducted to this indigenous lawyer, Jose Santos Zapon. He's a prominent figure in the indigenous movement in Guatemala. And he acknowledged that the indigenous leaders have made unprecedented inroads with Arévalo's administration. They have regular meetings. They have like a better relationship. And let's remember that back in 2023, when the AG's office tried to prevent Arévalo from to be sworn in January, the indigenous movement was key, not only because of the street protests we saw, but let's remember that the indigenous movement literally camped for weeks, for months outside the AG's headquarters as a protest sign. And actually, the first thing Arévalo did when he was sworn in January 14, 2024, was to visit this camp in the AG's headquarters. And but as Santos Zapon mentioned, I think that the indigenous movements are complex, and they are fragmented. They are complex. Sometimes he claims that sometimes you will see like people who present themselves as indigenous leaders and probably are not considered indigenous leaders in their communities. But I will say that I will highlight that the attitude of the government is pretty much different. You haven't seen yet like formal legal changes, but this attitude and the fact that he's willing to bring some people from the indigenous sectors into the government positions is definitely a big change.
It's a big change, and also, I mean, it's a realization and a recognition of a vast percentage of the Guatemalan community, the population. And of course, one of the things that always comes up when we're discussing indigenous rights is that of extractive industries. Well, in Guatemala, what kind of extractive industries are there that might threaten traditional lands belonging to indigenous groups?
I would say that the mining activity has decreased over the last 10 years in Guatemala. But you still have like an important activity in Izabal, which is the region close to the Atlantic side. And you have like a couple of, I'm forgetting if I pronounce it right, nickel. I don't know. Nickel. Okay, we have nickel minings in El Estor. Actually, one of these companies was sanctioned under U.S. laws and the sanctions were lifted afterwards. There's a bit of confusion with what happened there, but we have our operation there, and you could see the tensions and the complexities of this problem, because when the company was sanctioned and was suspended for a few months from operating, you also saw unemployment rates going up and the community actually feeling the economic hardship. But at the same time, you have some problems with human rights in some instances. I would say that during the Arévalos months, probably the most visible mining problem had to do with a different one. There is a gold mining operation in Jutiapa. This is a region close to El Salvador. And so, during the last days of the President Yamatei administration, they received this environmental permit to operate this extension. And after a few months, the Arévalo government saw a lot of complaints for environmental problems, especially in the river. And that affected also some communities from El Salvador. And in June, the government decided to suspend this permit. And that's probably the most relevant action you have seen over the Arévalo months.
Okay, so I mean, it's nickel, gold, and so on. It's the same. It's a similar story to so many different places. If we talk about, let's say, you mentioned El Salvador, and of course, I would say the water, the rivers, contaminated, I assume, with mercury from a gold mine and so on. But if we talk about Guatemala's neighbors in the region, how is Arévalo when it comes to foreign policy? He's not got the greatest friends around him. I think Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, Xiomara Castro in Honduras, and then down Ortega in Nicaragua. Not great neighbors. How is the relationship going to be with President Sheinbaum in Mexico?
Well, with President Sheinbaum, I think he's going to have a good relationship. He had a good relationship with AMLO too. Mexico always has this Estrada doctrine, this neutral stance, so they always have good relationship with us. And Arévalo, let's remember that Arévalo has a strong diplomatic background. He was a diplomat himself for various years. So I think that's a zone where he feels very comfortable. I see a relationship with Mexico going smoothly. The region is complicated. I mean, Central America is complicated because when he was a president-elect during this long period of transition, by the way, we have this 6 months transition period, which is crazy. Yes. He made some critical remarks to Bukele. And after a few days, he just changed his mind and stopped saying things about our neighbors. And he has, hold friendly relationship with El Salvador and Honduras, but with Nicaragua, he had some strong words recently because of the Parlacen, the Central American Parliament, that they admitted Russia as an observatory member.
That obviously Panama spoke out, Guatemala spoke out, and this does, Nicaragua in favor of Russia. When we talk about these kind of regimes, Guatemala still recognizes Taiwan, I believe. Is there a possibility of them flipping to China? Probably not under Arévalo right now.
Absolutely not. And he made it clear. He was in New York a few days ago for the UN's assembly, and he had a word in the Council of Foreign Relations in this very interesting and hour-long conversation. And he was asked straightforward if he's considering moving with China, and he said no. I reaffirm our diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, and he even suggested that that's an opportunity for Guatemala to engage in the CHIPS Act of the U.S. to bring some investment to Guatemala, and that he was firm with staying with Taiwan. If you look at Arévalos, he's sometimes pictured as a leftist in Guatemala. But I don't think I don't know if he's a leftist or right wing, but definitely he has been very critical of authoritarian regimes in the region, and even, especially left wing authoritarian regimes like Venezuela. And he not only had these comments on China and Taiwan, but also was very clear about Venezuela, for example. And he's very clear about how he rejects the results announced by the Venezuela's National Electoral Council, and how he thinks that Maduro is not a legitimate president. And, he's pretty clear in his foreign policy.
Oh, we have to applaud this kind of behavior. I would be very hard pressed to describe Arévalo as a leftist, like in a traditional left wing thing. I would say he's more of a pragmatist, but and as he has democratic attitudes, as you've so rightly put. He believes in the rule of law and the institutions. And of course, that's what he's coming up against in Guatemala at every turn. It does seem a bit negative, obviously, what we've talked about, but I do see the positive side of things when we discuss, again, Arévalo's own personality, his stance against the Chinese regime, his stance against Venezuela, his stance against Nicaragua, remaining with Taiwan. Of course, we must see this as positive. But as we wind this down, Edgar, how do you feel that domestic policy then over time, how do you feel that it will result in this presidency for Arévalo? Will he have time to actually get anything done?
Well, that's the question we all are asking ourselves, because as I said at the beginning, I see Guatemala's situation as a transition of regime, not of government. And to me, it's very clear that we had all the symptoms of an authoritarian regime. And how do you transit from that to a democratic regime? And my biggest concern with Arévalo's approach is that just by acting or behaving democratically, things aren't going to change, especially if you don't have the infrastructure of a democracy. I mean, modern democracy is grounded in so many institutional arrangements that we lack. We don't have a civil service, for example. So it's not a matter of if you are a Democrat or not. I mean, the spoil system is in place. I mean, all the appointments in the state, in the judiciary, are not meritocratic, are by nepotism or any other arrangement. And it works that way because we don't have the institutional arrangement for doing that. So unless you bring like structural reforms into the table, you're not going to be able to change that. And he seems decided to, try to change things with the existing institutional arrangement. And in my opinion, that's very hard. I mean, it's very hard that you succeed in changing things if you don't actually speak of a constitutional reform to fix like the biggest problems that we have, especially in the judicial system, or if you don't work in comprehensive civil service reform, for example.
So we can draw from this. Your feeling is that he's not pushed far enough. He's not forcing back against the Pacto de Corruptos. He's acting democratically, but it's not enough.
It's not enough. And let's remember that all Arévalo has is popular support. That's basically his asset. People trusted him against the traditional political elites. And people are tired of these old politicians, like in many other Latin American countries. And if you don't bring like actual change, people are going to get mad. People are going to get disappointed. And that's not good for him, because all he has is the popular support. If he loses that, we are in big trouble as a country. Yeah. And that's why I feel like he's in a position where he needs to do something big to demonstrate people that he's actually working on a big change and working on something that will mean that the country is going to change for good. Whereas he's trying to work with the current arrangement, he's just showing that he can do or he can achieve much. And that is, I think, the place we are now.
A big change would be like a referendum on constitutional reform or rewriting of the constitution or something of that nature.
I would say I'm not that ambitious to say like we need to refund the estate, because probably that's pushing too hard and it may be negative for him. But as I said, for example, you could see how Arévalo is watching this selection process of the Supreme Court, and he couldn't do anything. I mean, he he saw in front of his eyes how the old system appointed 13 Supreme Justices like in the old days. Yeah. Why? Because of the rules of the game. So when I speak of constitutional reform, I'm speaking of how to modernize and democratize the state in the areas where things are not working. And clearly justice is the main problem right now. If you look at the last 5 years, as I mentioned, the main tool of the Pact of the Corrupt is the justice system. Why? Because if you live in this fragmented political regime, the easiest and more legitimate way of achieving your anti-democratic goals is through the judicial system. The judicial system has more, even though people doesn't trust the justice system, is of course more legitimate than the politicians. So every time you see former prosecutor or former journalist fleeing the country, they say, well, that's the law. They're facing prosecution. They should be fighting for their cases in the tribunals, blah, blah, blah. And that's, to me, a key reform if you want to change things for good.
As you said, entirely co-opted judicial system by the Pacto de Corruptos. Well, here's hoping for some positive news in the coming years, months and years in Guatemala, and that Bernardo Arévalo can, let's say, take the fight to a more level playing ground with the Pacto de Corruptos. Let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Edgar Ortiz, who is an expert in constitutional law and political risk in Guatemala. It has been an absolute pleasure discussing this with you. Of course, if you return to Guatemala, be very careful because, of course, your opinions are quite outspoken and you don't want to rub the wrong people up the wrong way.
It was a pleasure, Richard. Thanks for having me.
It's been a great pleasure, as I said. We've been speaking to Edgar Ortiz, expert in constitutional law and political risk from Guatemala. This has been the Latin News Podcast. I have been your host, Richard McCall, here in Colombia. We'll be back in a fortnight's time with further information and interviews from the region. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.